Yeah, I must start.
All right, let's get started with the lecture of your biostatistics course. This is the second to last statistics lecture, and now the statistics and the programming are going to start getting more and more intertwined. So hopefully you've been feeling comfortable with both halves, because now we're really bringing them together. The first thing I should mention, we are adding a tutoring session on Mondays, so that the Thursday tutoring sessions are still happening. You should go to them so you have more time to think about your homework. But if the worst befalls you, now there's an option for Monday, FLTC 303 at 5:30 p.m., same time, same place, but now also on Mondays. Again, try to go to the Thursday one so you've actually got time to do your homework, except the night before. But we all know how that goes. Next, I wanted to briefly point out a common mistake that a lot of people were making on their homework, the last statistics homework, where we were talking about worm breeding and Punnett squares. And I think the mistake is probably more due to not reading the homework carefully rather than not thinking about the statistics right. But let me take an example. Up on the screen you see the question about what happens if we got a DAF2 recessive GFP homozygous, or GFP heterozygous animal is one of our founder animals. And we wanted to know, well, what fraction of the animals of the self-offspring of this guy, this hermaphrodite guy, I guess, what fraction of the self-offspring are going to be GFP homozygous? And so, you know, if you think about our Punnett square, how do you do that? Well, what kind of sperm can we make? Well, we can have D minus G plus, or D minus G minus, or D minus G plus, or D minus G minus. So there's really only two different kinds of sperm that this individual could make. One of their two copies of the D minus, and either the G plus or the G minus. And same thing with the eggs that the animal could make. Does that all make sense? I mean, this is like high school biology for sure. But then the question is, well, okay, what fraction of the total offspring are going to be GFP homozygous positive? And obviously the only one out of these four possibilities is this one. And so the answer is 1/4. Then the question is, okay, but we know that we can look down a microscope and see that some of them are glowing green. And so which ones are glowing green? Everyone who has at least one copy of GFP plus glows green. So that's 3 out of the 4 total. So if we restrict ourselves only to looking at the green worms, which we can tell trivially by looking at the microscope, what fraction of the green worms are GFP positive homozygous? And that's 1 out of 1, 2, 3. So again, it sort of seems simple when you lay it out this way, but this is a really basic and important question in conditional probability. If we condition on only looking at the green worms, we can throw this one out. We're no longer dividing by 4, we're dividing by 3, because that's the only possibilities that we get. So if this isn't clear, come talk to me afterwards. Hopefully, mostly it was a question of reading the homework carefully and remembering to actually draw out a Punnett square. Now you might think, well, okay, why are we doing Punnett squares? This is a stats class. I'm taking genetics next quarter. As we already saw in the last lecture, and we're going to see again in this lecture, all kinds of statistics come in little 2x2 tables of successes and failures, and a Punnett square is really a special case of the very common statistical 2x2 table that we're going to see today again and multiple times. So you need to pay attention to what these statistical concepts are, even if they look like they're a genetics problem. Okay, next thing I'm going to talk about is a little bit of programming, and this is going to be useful for this lecture and for the homework, because we're going to start programming things and making lists of things a lot. So let's just go back to something that we've seen a lot so far. Can everyone see this all right? Do I need to lower the lights or make the font a little bigger? Is that good? Okay, so what's this first line? We've got a data list. So we've got 4 things that are stored in this list that we're calling data. And then we've all seen this for loop before. For item in data, and then we're going to do something with that item. We're going to take its absolute value, and we're going to print out the absolute value. Does everyone pretty much get what this is going to print when I hit run? Right. It's going to print out the absolute value of each of these items in the list one at a time. Now, let's think about what that's actually doing. So this 4 item in data, it's saying, okay, we've got this list of things, and we're going to take the things one at a time. First, we're going to take 7 and set the value of this variable to 7. So item is 7, and we're going to take the absolute value of it and print it out. Then the next time we go through, we're going to take the next item, and that's going to be -3. And we're going to calculate something about it and print out the new value. So each time we go through the loop, or sorry, we go through the loop one time for each thing in this list. And each time we go through the loop, this variable, which is, we could call it, for I, or for, anything, any name, gets the value of the thing in the list, and then the next loop we go through the next and the next. Does this make sense? Sort of basically, okay, we're taking one at a time and going through it. So how do we do something a little more interesting than just printing out? What if we want to make a new list where the absolute values are stored in the new list? Well, that's actually fairly straightforward also. Let's do this. Let's say, okay. So we're going to make an empty list that says, okay, then we're just going to name it absolute value of the data. So abs data is an empty list. And then we'll do, for every single item in the data, one at a time, we're going to say new value equals absolute value of the item. And then here's the new thing. I think it's new. Maybe we've done it in the homework. So we're going to append to the list the new value. So what do you think is going to happen when we run this? All right, think to yourself, and we will run it. Okay, we have a list that contains the absolute value of every item, pretty much as you would expect. Question?
Is there a reason you have to use item instead of I?
No, completely up to you. You can use anything you would like, as long as it's a valid variable name in Python. So it can't be like $. It has to start with a letter and not have spaces in it. Okay, so, and again, we don't technically need this new value thing. That's just sort of a temporary name for the absolute value of the item. We could just directly append that to the list, and we get the same list out. Does everyone see how these variables are just sort of useful temporary names for things to help clarify our code? Okay, so let's look at some other bit of for loop that we've seen before. So everyone knows what this is going to do now. We've had some experience with these range things. So this is going to count from 0 to 9. So the range to the 10th item. And remembering, we always start at 0. So that gives us 10 things, 0 through 9, prints them out one at a time. So remember, this for loop just steps through one thing at a time in a list. So what does that tell you that this range thing is? And it's something like a list. So let's look at it. Okay, Odor, what is this? This is something that acts a little bit like a list, and we can convert it to a list. So let's just do that. There we go. It's a list from 0 to 9 that we can step through. Now, why didn't it just give us the list to begin with? Well, it turns out if you wanted to count to like 10 billion, it would be silly to have every single number from 1 to 10 billion sitting in a different place in your computer's memory. You'd fill up your computer's memory before you could get much more counting done. So this range thing just coughs up one number at a time. And we'll see this a few other times in this little mini lecture. But remember, anything that you can go through with a for loop like this, we can just convert into a list and have them all out in front of us at one time. Okay, so what if we want to step through two lists at once? So let's do that. Let's say, everyone see this all right? Yeah. So we have one list that contains 3 letters, and one list that contains 3 numbers, ABC 1, 2, 3. So the way that we've learned before was to get an index, the number 0 through 3, and just get the value out of each of those lists. So what do I mean by that? So we've seen this before in the homeworks as well. So we're going from I equals 0, I equals 1, and I equals 2, and we're getting the 0, first, and second elements out of each of these lists at the same time and printing them out. So this is pretty much what you would expect from that code, right? Everyone on board with that? Well, it turns out we've got a slightly more elegant way of doing that as well. And this is actually getting somewhere useful. So what is this doing? This little zip thing is taking 2 lists and zipping them together. So we can get 1 letter and 1 number from these 2 things zipped together. So, well, okay, well, what is this zip thing? Let's do our usual trick of looking at it. You can always learn a lot just by looking at something. Oh dear, it's one of these things that we don't really know what it is. Well, we know we can turn it into a list. Let's try that. And here we go. It's giving us one list which is containing a pair, the first element of each one, the second, and the third element of each one. So we get this pair and we just split it out into letter and number, and then we print out the letter and then the number. And you can play with this on your own, but you can zip more than 2 lists. You can zip as many lists as you want together. So let's get a little more complicated. What if we want the index and the number, or the index and the data item? Well, we can do that too. We know how to get the indices, that's range. We know how to get the items. We know how to put them together with a zip, so that would be okay, does everyone see a bit about how this is working? We're zipping together this range that goes from 0 to the size of the data thing and the data thing together. And we're asking, okay, for the number and the thing in my data list, print them both out. So 0th item of the data list is 7. The first item is -3. And if you remember when we defined our data list way at the beginning, 7, -3, 6.6, 12. So we're just getting these back out. There's a convenience method for this because this is something you're going to need to do a lot writing code. And that is you can just enumerate the data. In parentheses. And so that's exactly the same. So if we want to again, okay, well what is this enumerate thing doing? Let's, turn it into a list. And you should be able at this point to predict pretty well what this is going to be. It's a list of pairs containing the number, or the index, and then the element from the data array at that index. Okay, so it turns out that pandas data frame objects and and the columns in pandas data frames can be treated very similarly. So a pandas data frame is kind of like a collection of different columns. So what we've done before was just pull them out with the indexing, with one at a time. Like we did here. Now I'm going to show you a new way to deal with these pandas objects. It's a little more elegant and a lot faster. So let's open up some data. Okay, so we've loaded that data file that we've been playing with for the last couple homeworks. And remember, the old way that we did for adding a new column looked like this. So we make some new empty column, we're going to fill it with zeros, then for all the indices in the range of all of the rows in the data frame, we're going to do that loc thing. I mean, I don't know why you'd want to divide the transcription start position by 2 and put that in a new thing, but we're going to do that. And that ran, well, actually you see this little asterisk, it is still running. It's going to take a while. It's going to take a while because this is slow. This DF, the loc thing, as some of you guys have discovered, is kind of slow and kind of magical. And it's trying to do a whole lot. It's looking to see, okay, we're going to stuff this value in this column at this position. What is that position? Let's look up where that column is. Let's make sure that it's the right data type. It's doing a lot of checking, and it's going to take, 10 or 20 seconds, which seems silly for such a seemingly fast calculation. So it turns out that there's just a lot better way to do this. And that better way is to use a normal for loop and walk through a column in the data frame just like we would any other list of data. So we can do that. Let's do... Okay, it finally finished. That was slow. Okay, so the first thing, we're going to grab the transcription start column. And let's just... Okay, so this is, it's a column, but it turns out we can do exactly the same kind of thing that we did with any other list. 4 item, transcription start. And I'm not going to print out all of them because that would be kind of slow. So let's just print out the first 20 items. All right, so that worked pretty much as we would expect. So how are we going to put this all together to very quickly make a new list containing transcription start divided by 2 for all of the positions? All right, well that's this. So does everyone see why this is going to work? We're going to step through every transcription start position, and one at a time we're going to call each one TS, and then to our new list we're going to append half of whatever that value is. I'm going to hit run. Hey, it's done. Now all we have to do is put that back into the data frame. And there we go. So this is not only more elegant, it's faster and more sensible. So in the homework, you're going to use these tools to calculate the 3' UTR lengths in the same way we did last time, but rather more quickly. Okay, so that's our little introduction to coding for loops and really what they mean. And now, why do we care about this? This is going to be very, very important for the bulk of today's lectures, which is solving statistical problems by simulation. Now, there's sort of two ways to solve a statistical problem. You can simulate the process that's going on and get a sense of what the answer is going to be, or you can think very carefully and reason your way through what the answer has to be mathematically. I'm going to bring up a classic example. It's not an example from biology, but it's sort of a classic pop culture example that shows you why simulation is, it turns out, a much lower risk option than trying to think through the answer and hoping that you're right. So the example is called the Monty Hall three-door problem. Has anyone heard of the Monty Hall three-door problem? Okay, so some of you know it. Let's go through the example and try to work out why a simulation is really the right thing to do in cases where there are brain teasers. I'll leave this up. So the setup, Monty Hall is a guy. He was a mid-century game show host. And one game supposedly, they didn't actually play this game on the game show, but one game supposedly goes as follows. You've got three doors. Door number 1, door number 2, and door number 3. Behind one of the doors is a brand new car. And, you know, it was the 50s, so there's probably like some tail fin or something. Behind the other two doors are goats. This is presumably because a billy goat is something that you don't want in comparison to a car. You know, to each their own. Especially this warped goat. But... Okay. So, you, the contestant, get to choose one door. So you choose a door. Then Monty Hall dramatically opens up another door, revealing a goat. Now, the choice that Monty Hall gives you is, do you stay with the door that you chose originally, or do you change to the other closed door? Obviously, you're not going to change to the door that you just opened that has a goat. So should you switch? And the obvious answer is it makes no difference, right? Like, there are two doors, they're both closed, one of them has a car, one of them has a goat. Obviously it's 50-50. There's no way that switching could possibly improve your chances, right? Like, this is totally obvious. So this question ran in the Ask Maryland column of Parade magazine in like the late 90s. This is probably the high point of the pop culture relevance of Ask Maryland and Parade magazine, because it generated months of discussion. Statistics professors wrote in with conflicting answers. Like, statistics professors got this wrong because they couldn't reason through the logic. So let's not try to reason through the logic. Let's just try to simulate it. Let's write a little computer program to simulate what I would do and what Monty Hall would do, and let's see what the answer really is. And then, armed with the correct answer, maybe we can go back and figure out why it's correct. All right. So, let's start simply. Let's say, okay, doors equals, there are three doors. We're calling them 1, 2, and 3. All right. Now, what I'm going to do is define a function. We haven't really defined functions before. We've called functions like print, or sum, or lin, or range. These are functions that give you something back. So how do we make our own function to give us something back? It's actually really simple. It's def for define, stay. And when we say parentheses, that means we're defining a function. And this function doesn't take any variables. We don't have to pass it in anything. It's going to do all of its work on its own. All right, so a function is just a few lines of code that you can execute repeatedly whenever you call, in this case, stay. So what are we going to do? Oh, I forgot one thing. We need to... So we're going to import the random number generators from the numerical Python library that comes with your Anaconda installation. All right, so how do we choose the door that the car is behind? All right, well, I happen to know that there's a function called choice, which gives you a random choice from from a list. All right, so I happen to know that this is going to work. You don't necessarily happen to know that this is going to work. How do we discover stuff like this? You know, we can Google around and we can look at the documentation. But it turns out that IPython has some really powerful features for discovering what things do and what's available. So let's say, so random is the sort of toolbox of random number things. Dot means, okay, we're going to go into this toolbox and grab some particular tool from the box. What if I just hit tab? It's going to give me everything. It's going to give me a little scroll bar of everything in this toolbox. And I say, oh, choice. Choice seems like, you know, maybe what I want. I want to choose one of this list. So let's do random choice. Just double click that and it'll give me that. And I can put the question mark. We've seen this before. Run that. And it'll give me the whole documentation for random choice. Say, okay, we need to give it something called A, and it says A is like a array-like or a list, some number of elements, and we give it a size. How many things do we want back? If we don't give it anything, it gives you one single thing. Do we want to sample with or without replacement? Okay, we'll talk about this a little more later, but for now, all we need to know is that all we have to give it is one thing, and it'll give us one list-like thing, and it'll give us one thing back. So random.choice doors can give me 3. If I run this again, oh, it gives me a different random choice from the doors list. This seems useful. So I'm going to say, in defining my function here, car door, the door that the car is behind is something from 1 to 3. I'm going to choose a door randomly. And then what do we do? What does the function return? It returns whether or not I was successful in winning the car. So let's return. Give me back whether or not the car door, the number 1 through 3 that the car was behind, is the same as the number I chose. All right, so how do we call this function? We just do this. We call it. Say, okay, if I call this once, it returned false. If I call it again, oh, it's still false. Oh, this time it's true. So, you know, it's giving me random numbers back, or random results back, some of which are true and some of which are false. So let's see, you know, okay, obviously we know how many times I'm going to be successful just staying, right? Like, what's the number, what's the percentage of the time that I'm going to be successful with this strategy? 1/3, right. You know, this we don't have to simulate. But let's walk through how we would do the simulation. Okay. So let's make a variable called the successes with my stay strategy, and we're going to set that to 0 for some number in, you know, we're going to do 10,000 steps. And what we're going to do is, for each of these steps, if stay is true, so if I was successful with this strategy, I'm going to say that the number of successes with my stay strategy, I'm going to add that to 1. So plus equals 1 means stay successes equals whatever its whole value was plus 1. And then when I'm done with that list, or when I'm done with that loop going through 10,000 times, I'm going to print out the fraction of the times that I was successful. All right, so, right, it's going to print some number around 1/3. It's probably not going to print 1/3 every time, because again, this is random. You know, you wouldn't expect every single time we would get exactly 3,333.333 cars for every 10,000 games that we play with Monty Hall. Okay, so that's the basic setup for simulation of this simple strategy. Now let's simulate the more complex strategy. So I'm just going to copy this, and let's change it to be a more complicated strategy. So change the strategy of changing the door. So it starts out the same. We choose a door. There's a door randomly behind some car. So now, Monty Hall has a limited number of options for the doors that he can open. Obviously, he can't open the door that I chose, and he can't open the door that's the car is behind. So how do we figure out what door Monty Hall is going to open? So you're going to go Monty So we're just going to start out with an empty list. Okay, he's going to have some number of options for the doors that he could open. Let's figure out what those are. Okay, so for door and doors, so we're just going to go through the doors, 1, 2, and 3, and say, okay, so Monty's not going to open my door, so if the door is not my door, and the door isn't the door that the car is behind, this door is a valid one that Monty might be able to open. Everyone with me on that? Does this little bit of logic seem reasonable? Seems to be simulating what Monty Hall can do? Yeah?
You spell Monty differently.
Oh, yeah, thank you. There's a reason I tend to spell Monty with an E, because this is a Monte Carlo method of simulation. It's not a pun, I mean, it's just literally... okay, so obviously he's only going to open one of the possible doors that he might be able to open, so that's... Okay, so Monty Hall opens a door. I have chosen a door, and my strategy is going to be to change to the door that wasn't the one that Monty opened, that also wasn't the one that I chose. So how do we figure out what that door was? Well, that's easy enough. We'll just do the same kind of thing. For door, if door, so if the door that we're considering, door 1, 2, or 3, is not my door, and it's not the door that Monty opened, then that's got to be the other door. So I mean, you could write out a much more complicated sort of case of logic. Well, if I chose door 1 and Monty opened door 2, then my door is door 3. And if I chose door 2 and Monty opened, you know, you could write sort of a really complicated statement. But if you think about it, this is always going to give us the other door that's not the one that I chose and not the one that Monty opened. And this will be a good exercise to think about. All right, so now we return true if we're going to change. So if the car door is the other door. All right, does everyone sort of buy this basic logic that we're going to simulate what the strategy looks like when we change doors based on what Monty tells us? Any questions about? And if this is a little unclear, the best thing you could possibly do is go through this in your head, write down what each of these variables is going to be, and just sort of simulate, okay, every step of the way, write it down. Okay, what does this door variable hold now? What are my possible options? What is random choice going to choose from? And just go through a couple times until you see the logic of this. All right. So now let's run the simulation. Okay, so there's a moment of truth. Do we get a better return on investment than 33%? If I run this game show 10,000 times. 66% of the time. This is, at least for some people, in fact most people when they first hear about the Monty Hall problem, highly counterintuitive. Like I said, statistics professors who tried to reason it out got this wrong. Turns out it is just a lot easier to write out a computer program that embodies the logic of what's going on than it is to reason through all of the possibilities for how the truth might be. And this is just fundamentally a true statement about human nature and human thinking. So I'll send this out, this code out. You should play with it, you should take it apart, you should try running it in your head to see exactly how it's working. But let's do a little bit, let's just talk about the logic really quickly. Why is it in fact the case that we should change the door? So obviously, 1/3 of the time, you're going to pick the car door, the door that the car is behind correctly. And so if we stay with this, and Monty Hall is going to reveal some random goat, 1 of 2 goats, Monty Hall is going to open, but we're going to stay with the one we chose. And so 1/3 of the time, staying with the one we chose gets us a car. All right, that's obvious. That's the sort of straightforward strategy. What if we change? Okay, so if our strategy is changing, 1/3 of the time we picked the car to begin with, and we change to some goat. So that's bad. So 1/3 of the time we fail. What if we initially picked a goat? We initially pick a goat. Monty Hall is now somewhat constrained. Monty cannot open this door because he's going to show us the car. Monty can only open this goat door. So now that this goat door is open, this goat door is the one we already chose, changing will get us the car. So in sort of Ron Burgundy terms, 66% of the time, this works all the time. So that's why 2/3 of the time we're successful with this change strategy, which is exactly what we saw in the simulation. Again, it's always easier to explain something once you already know the answer. Okay. So this is an example from a fictitious game show in the 1950s. Can we do better than that? This is a biostatistics course. All right. Let's choose an example from biology. Using this human genome data that we've been playing with already. Let's say you're studying some mRNA binding factor there's a distinct interest to your lab, and you want to know what mRNAs it's binding to. So there's a great new technology called CLIP-seq, cross-linking immunoprecipitation, where you've got your mRNA binding factor, and it's floating around in the cells, bounds to mRNAs. So you do the natural thing, which is pour a bunch of formaldehyde on the cell and cross-link your binding factor to your mRNAs. You pull it down with an antibody with some kind of magnetic bead on it. You reverse the cross-links, and then you sequence whatever came down from your pull-down assay. So this is a little bit like ChIP-seq that some people might be familiar with. So we get a bunch of sequences out, and we find out what this thing was sticking to. So let's say that we found that our particular mRNA binding protein of interest sticks to 15, and only 15 different mRNAs. So, it's possible. There's RNA binding factors that are very specific. And so we're going to do some research on these 15 genes, because they seem like they're probably relevant to what this thing is doing, right? And we find out that I just noticed that all of these genes, all 15 genes, have less than 12 exons. Is that interesting? Does that tell us something about what this gene is doing? That it's all a 12 exon or fewer binder? Or is that totally uninteresting and irrelevant? So let's find out. All right, so we loaded this the whole genome data. So I forget what's in what the columns are. So I'm just going to do dataframe.columns. Oh yeah, we've got exon count. And these are mRNAs, so they're really the protein coding genes. So let's constrain ourselves to just the protein coding genes. So PC equals, and we've seen this before. So we're pulling out a subset of the genes, just the protein coding genes. Oh, I called it DF. All right, there we go. All right, so now we want the exon counts for the protein coding genes. So PC everyone buy that now we have a list that contains just the exon counts for the protein coding genes. We can, print it out and says, yep, we've got a bunch of exon counts. Okay, so let's just ask, the sort of very first question we could ask, is the fact that this thing binds genes with less than 12 exons interesting? So what's the mean exon count across the whole genome worth of protein coding genes? And what's the median? So the mean is 10. Got ahead of myself. Someone knew the answer already. And the median is 8. So, we found a gene that binds stuff that only has 12 exons or fewer, and, most genes have 8 or 10 exons. Is this interesting? Doesn't seem interesting. But let's actually rigorously answer that question. How could we answer whether it's interesting? Well, one way we might call it interesting is if it's unusual from what you would expect just by drawing random sets of genes out of the genome. Does everyone believe me that that might be a good definition for interesting? If it's unlikely to find 15 genes, all of which have 12 exons or fewer. So how do we figure out if it's unlikely to find 15 genes, all of which have 12 exons or fewer? Well, let's just ask that question. So remember there's this random choice. And I can hit tab even if I've only typed just a couple letters because I forgot how to spell choice. So I hit tab and it says, oh, I can choose chi-square or choice. Well, it's choice that I want, so I'm just going to do that. So this tab completion is really powerful. It makes it so you don't have to type nearly as much as you would otherwise. So if I do the question mark again, it's going to say, okay, we give it a thing to choose from and a size, and whether or not we want to replace. So now this actually matters. Okay, so we're going to choose randomly from the protein coding exon counts, 15 of them. And we want to choose without replacement. Because if you're choosing with replacement, you choose some exon and then you put it back into the bucket. You choose some gene, you get its exon count, and you put that gene back into the bucket, so you might get it again. And this doesn't really make sense because we want 15 distinct genes from the human genome, just like we got 15 distinct mRNAs. So we have to choose a choice without replacement. Does that make sense? Everyone heard these sort of basic terminology before? I don't want to have to start talking about balls and urns if I don't have to. Oh, cool. I hit REP and then I hit tab and it says, oh, replace is totally a thing that you could give this to. Replace equals. So this tab completion is fantastic. Really, use it all you can. Every time you can't remember something, well, I'll just hit tab and see what I can do with it. All right, so what does this give me when I run it? It gives me the exon counts for 15 randomly selected genes without replacement. Okay, so we can see that this one has some genes that have more than 12 exons, right? So is that unusual or highly regular? So let's ask that question in a very simple simulation standpoint. So less than or equal to 12 equals 0, because we haven't done any yet, but we're going to step through, we'll just do 5,000 this time. And I happen to know that this is going to be a little slow, because choosing without replacement is slow. You have to remember which ones you chose and make sure you don't choose them again. So what I'm going to do is so what this little percent sign means is if I divide I by 100, give me back the remainder. If the remainder is 0, so that means every 100 times we're going to do something, print I. Okay, that's just to give us some feedback without having to print 1 through 5,000. So now we do exon counts equals this random choice, so we're going to get these 15 counts of exons for 15 random genes. And what do we want to do? We want to know what the maximum number of exons across all my 15 genes are. So if the maximum of the exon counts is less than or equal to 12, so So you just have to know that the max is a function that Python gives you. There's some things that you just have to learn. And this is how you learn them. Okay, does everyone sort of buy the logic of what's going on here? And then when we're done, we're going to print the fraction of those times that we actually did get this event of having fewer than 12 exons in all of the genes. Does it seem like a reasonable thing to do? Any questions so far? All right, so let's run the code. Okay, as promised, it's a little bit slow. We're going through about 60,000 genes in the human genome that code for proteins, choosing 15 of them at a time and asking, of those 15 random that we chose, is it the case that all of them have fewer than 12 exons? Where are we now? Oh, almost. The tension is unbearable. Less than 1% of the time. Less than 1% of the time is my collection of 15 genes have 12 or fewer exons. So that tells me that this protein is actually really interesting. It's got some kind